For our final wrap-up session, our moderator is Linda Marsa, who is a longtime freelance science writer and the author of the book Fevered: Why a Hotter Planet Will Hurt Our Health and How We Can Save Ourselves. Linda.
Is this working? No. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I have a loud voice. Anyway, it's been a long day, but thank you all for coming. I'm going to sort of summarize a little bit of what happened this morning for those of you who weren't here for the morning sessions. This is very important. I do want to give you all a little heads up. At the very end of the session, we are going to talk about the elephant in the room, because I know it's on everybody's mind, but we didn't want it to take over the day, because it would have, because we're all very upset. But anyway, let me just sort of launch into, I wanted to give sort of an overview of what we talked about. The first thing that really struck me is that there isn't a lot of good data out there, and it's not for want of trying. You know, as Lee talked about in the last session, it's really hard to do these public health studies, you know, to do them in a way that, you know, it's so discrete that you can really prove causation. And correlation is not causation, but, you know, a lot of times you're looking at this stuff and you're going, I mean, this is blindingly obvious, right? You know, if you drink more water, you know, it's not going to hurt, you know, your kidneys are going to be better, you know, things like that. So that's one thing, you know, we're dealing with that kind of handicap, is that we're not dealing with a whole lot of data. You know, there's a lot of information out there, but it's not, you know, well proven. The second thing is that, you know, this is just general remarks, is that workers are at the front lines of climate change. I think it was Lee, our most recent speaker, who said workers are the canaries in the coal mine. So I want to, you know, drill down on that a little later in my remarks. But this is also very, very important, what's going on with workers. And I think at some statistic like 92% of workers in Africa are exposed to heat stress. And I think it's something like 76% or something like that in Africa. So we're going to start seeing more and more and more of this. I mean, I'm sure you all saw that article in the New York Times within the past year about all these Nepalese people who have been working in Dubai, and they're all on dialysis machines. So this is, you know, a little glimpse into the future. The third thing that I want to mention is that a lot of the worker protections that we have in this country are not well enforced. So we have to talk about that too. I'd like to drill down into some of the presentations that we had this morning when you guys, a lot of you guys weren't here, and if those of you who were here, please bear with me. Of course, we had an excellent presentation from Dr. Ibai, and she gave a really good overview of exactly what's going on. The weather's getting worse, we all know this, but you know, the facts are, in the summer of 2022, 60,000 Europeans died of heat stroke. 2023, 44,000 Europeans. In Africa, it's even worse. Pregnant women, we're seeing more hypertension, low birth weight babies, breathing in polluted air. You know, when there are higher temperatures, ER visits go up. You know, there's various shifts that are taking place. There were $24 billion disasters so far this year. And that'll probably be the least number of disasters from here on out. So at a certain point, you know, these become insurance disasters too. And we're really starting to see the impact of this in California, Texas, Florida, you know, where people can't get insurance for their homes. So that's the thing, you know, we can look at sort of these general things, but there's also these, you know, ripple effects, these nuances of ripple effects. You know, you're going to have people that are going to be forced out of their homes, having to force to migrate, higher levels of mental illness, PTSD, et cetera, and they're all climate related. That's a threat. Workers are especially being affected: India, Africa, Middle East, construction workers. Okay, and Dr. Ibai went through a lot of the key areas. Obviously, heat waves, high heat, the physiology of heat waves, things that happen to you because of heat. Here's another one, fire-induced wildfires. Fire-induced particulate matter because of rising wildfires. And we see that, I'm in California, we see this all the time. And particulate matter, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, is really important because the really small particles, you breathe them in, you breathe them out, not a big deal. But the 2.5 particulate matter, they go deep into the lungs and they stay there. So, it's really, very bad for you, really. And what is really important about wildfires these days, as Dr. Ebi said, it's not just trees. It's houses, it's cars, it's petroleum products, it's your computer, it's all that junk in the house. And so these wildfires are 3 times more toxic, and you're breathing that air. And we still don't know, again, no data, no studies, long terms, what happens with these exposures. Again, another area that's very important is the rise of vector-borne diseases. And we've known this is happening for a long time, but now we're really seeing it. One of the things that I remember writing about, 10 years ago, is that they were starting to see Lyme disease in Canada. Well, now it's endemic there, because it's warm enough to be hospitable to the tick that carries Lyme disease. And what's really, really worrisome now is the rise of dengue fever in Central and South America. And it's become an epidemic, in Brazil and areas like that, because I think it was something like 13 million people or something like that, are having dengue, which is a huge, huge number. The other thing that Dr. Ebi brought out that I thought was really, I did not know this, higher CO2 changes the nutritional quality of plants. I did not know this. They create more high carbohydrates, less protein, and essential nutrients. So what you're having is malnutrition, this hidden hunger that's affecting billions around the world. And you add that to the fact that, we're going to see more and more drought-induced famines around the world. So this is just, we're sort of at the leading edge of all of this, and it's just going to get worse. And what Dr. Ebi closed with is, when you think about climate change, stop thinking about polar bears. Think about children. So our next speaker was, and forgive me, I mispronounced your name, is Nishad Jayasundara. And this was just an absolutely fascinating presentation because he really drilled down on chronic kidney disease. And as I said earlier in my opening remarks, we don't have data. We don't have studies. But Sri Lanka, for a couple reasons that I'm going to bring out, which are very important, became a perfect natural laboratory because high literacy, high public awareness, and a very functioning public health system, so that they were able to do the kind of discrete studies to find out exactly what was going on. So they were able to look at, globally, 800 million people are at risk of kidney disease. People as young as 35, there's not a lot of awareness. And men are often more impacted, known as a widowmaker disease. And we're seeing high rates in El Salvador and Nicaragua, mostly farmers or farm-associated activities. We're going to start seeing this in California, Texas, North Carolina, Central America. And what he talked about is that Sri Lanka is what's called a sentinel location. And it's hot and dry, and up to 20% of people that work in these hot and dry areas in Sri Lanka are diagnosed with chronic kidney disease of what's called unknown or untraditional origin. And what we mean by untraditional origin is that if you have high blood pressure, you're overweight, or you have diabetes, you're prone to kidney disease. Or if you're a stupid idiot like somebody who's holding the microphone and talking right now and goes hiking and gets dehydrated, it happened to me. I didn't hydrate myself well. But this looked at strenuous work heat exposure with salt pan workers and other workers, and compared, how these diseases started, what kind of interventions helped. And when does the disease start? They're now looking at 3,500 school children, and this is really incredibly important and fabulous research that they're doing, because it's really looking at the progress in the course of the disease. Okay, and the kids are already showing declining kidney function, which is really incredible. I'm just going to go over quickly, what you saw this afternoon, and I'll be quiet pretty soon. What you saw this afternoon, I'll open it up to our panelists. There's federal standards, but they're not enforced, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. They're working very hard here in North Carolina to get these kind of standards. Again, not enforced. And the workforce, as we all know, are migrant, often undocumented. They're certainly not going to stick up for themselves. So, you have like sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. And as it gets hotter, more and more people are going to be affected. The last thing that I wanted to leave you with was the very good presentation that Lee did. And what I was most struck by in listening to him is just how difficult it is to get any real data, on public health issues. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit, we talked about kidney disease and all the other things that are happening with workers. I wanted Nisa, we had talked about, them getting kidney disease and all the terrible things that are going on, while they're working. But what happens afterwards? Because, I'm writing a book on public health now, and one of the sections of the book I'm dealing with is occupational health. And occupational health, before we had any kind of laws and rules, and what would happen is that, people like my ancestors came over here and were working in the factories, and they were working in terrible conditions, and they'd work maybe 4 years, and then they'd go back to the old country to die. I mean, this is really what happened. So are we seeing that here? Are we seeing that now?
Thank you. Yes. So yeah, that is something that we're seeing, at least among farm workers, who, as many of you may already know, many farm workers don't have access to health insurance. Even though they do qualify for the Affordable Care Act marketplace insurance, they don't always know about it. So, and then that's just some of the farm workers. Employers are not required to provide health insurance for them. So they develop these chronic diseases over time, and so by the time that they're into their later years, they have hypertension, kidney disease, diabetes, all these conditions that require a lot of care, but they don't have a social safety net to actually help them address those issues. So what they end up doing, a lot of them anyways, is just going back home to not just to die. They do get some care from their extended family network there, but it's still just, it's not being adequately addressed.
Do you feel this is a kind of unreported story?
Oh, yes, for sure. I think there could be more on that. I think it's been covered, but not enough.
Yeah, I have seen stuff in the Times, the New York Times, where they'll go down to Central America and stuff, but I think that this is really sort of an unreported thing. I mean, people leave the workforce, and then they're good. So Nicholas, we sort of talked about this. What stories do you see are the most important stories? And what are the things that you've gotten the most reaction for?
Yeah, I think that some of the most undercovered stuff in climate change has to do with basically business reporting. And I think that has to do with who we are as like environmental reporters. Like we like talking to scientists and people living in polluted communities or places that flood, or you know, politicians who are trying to crusade for a Green New Deal. We don't want to talk to like finance bros, and we don't want to look at earnings reports. And if we did want to do that, we could have been millionaires on Wall Street. So why would you go be an environmental reporter, dummy? But I think it's underratedly like a huge piece of this. So like, you know, like in Miami, where I'm from, I think it's much more likely that Miami gets destroyed not by floodwaters, but by rising insurance rates, or it becoming uninsurable and banks not being willing to lend against property in Miami, which just wrecks the actual underpinning of the economy of the place, and then long before the tide rises up, it's done. Or you look at like, why don't we have more offshore wind in the Northeast? Like, there was a lot of talk about that happening. Like, well, we got screwed on supply chains and inflation and interest rates, and all that raises the cost of producing electricity relative to natural gas. And so then investors said, well, screw it, I don't want to deal with the headaches of the people talking about, you know, bird strikes and whales and whatever, and I don't want to deal with it. Or same with like, heat pump installations are going down in Europe, and you have to look at the economic incentives for all of that. And so, like, I think a lot of times we maybe miss some of these stories or some of the explanation of what's going on, because I think just temperamentally we're like less inclined to talk to, again, finance bros. Well, I sympathize, you know. But, or whatever, business people, and want to understand, like, what are the financial incentives for you to do the right thing, or even to acknowledge that as, like, a necessary component to, like, saving the world, is, like, somebody has to make money doing it. And so I think we missed some of those stories.
Well, you know, you mentioned the financial incentives of doing the right thing, and, you know, we talked today about implementing standards in workplaces, and really, in the long run, it saves companies money by treating their workers well, but they don't seem to get this. I mean, is there any information out there that, you know, shows this, or?
Yeah, and I think, like, some of those would be probably the best stories at this point, where there's so much, I think, business opposition holding things up about, like, federal heat standard or state-level heat standards or local stuff. I mean, there is some research that shows that you save money by doing these things in the long run, and there's an upfront cost, and you save money in the back end, and that's like usually a formula for people acting against their best interests because they don't like the upfront cost and whatever. And so yeah, like I think we should be reporting more on that, and like what are the economic advantages of this? And you know, one thing Chris mentioned this morning is the health benefits of implementing a lot of these climate solutions pay for themselves by themselves without factoring in all the climate benefits and stuff like. I think that's a super powerful framework for thinking about you know, solutions to climate change, and I also think that it speaks to a different audience than if you just talk about the morality, the justice of wanting to not harm people. You're talking to an audience, and unfortunately that's not the entire audience. And if you bring in the economic incentives and say, well, actually, like, you're losing yourself money by not doing this, then you're speaking to a new audience now, and maybe bringing in more people to wanting to act on this.
Well, I think that's a good point, you know, because the moral imperative only goes so far. And, you know, we've sort of seen, we saw this on Tuesday, so unfortunately. So, so what do you think, so we looked at the economics, what do you think are the stories that you've gotten the best reactions to?
I did a story on green hydrogen, which is a kind of dubious climate solution. I think there's probably a place for it on the margins, and not as much as people say. Whatever, we don't have to get into the whole thing. But it's also like a technically really, like, can be a complicated thing to try to explain, because the basics of, like, why are we even talking about hydrogen, and, like, what is it about this atom that does something for us? And so anyway, I credit a lot of this to the like really talented design people that I get to work with at the Post, but like we did a story about that, and a lot of it was like a visual explainer of like how you produce this atom, which is the most abundant element in the universe, but then like why is it hard to isolate it, and what are the benefits of using it as a fuel, and that kind of thing. And we got a lot of really positive feedback of people saying, again, I think largely because of the visuals, not because of the words that I wrote, oh, this makes this way easier to understand.
Well, what do you think, aside from, say, the economics, what do you think are the important areas going forward?
I think one optimistic thing that you could say about climate is like a lot of the biggest solutions, like we kind of know what they are, like, you know, like and they're cost competitive, and like solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and electric cars and heat pumps, and like these things are all relatively cheap, and like you can make an economic case for them, which is crazy that exists, and it's just a question of like, are we going to build them fast enough for it to make a difference? Right. I mean, it's kind of oversimplifying it, but like, so I think so much of the story is just like, it's just that, like, are we going to build the things that we know work?
Yeah, I've heard that too, that we know what to do, and we have everything. It's just a matter of having the political will behind it. So, you know, and hopefully in some way we can contribute to all of this. Dr. Ebi, you know, I know you have to kind of run out, you know, and stuff, but, you know, we talked generally about the key points, and, you know, there's a lot of drilling down on, you know, kidney disease and things like that. But what do you see are the really big impending threats? I mean, one of the things that we didn't really talk about is the rise of zoonotic diseases. You know, and, you know, as you know, we just had a pandemic, and we're going to be seeing more of it, you know, with the interface between, you know, the wildlife and, you know, encroaching, and then, you know, air, et cetera, air travel. So maybe you could address that, and also what you foresee as the big looming threat.
It's a difficult question to answer. It depends on where and when. And that's an important point I hope you all keep in mind as you're writing about climate change, is everything is going to change. And what we're managing going forward is change itself. And thinking about being prepared, and it's not just climate change, demographics are changing rapidly. Urbanization is changing. We have global environmental change that's going on. The phosphorus and nitrogen flows are becoming critical in terms of their impact, not just on ecosystems, but on health. And so we're in a period of very dynamic change. One thing that personally I struggle with is people who say we've entered a new era, as if somehow we flipped from one set of environmental conditions to another set. We have flipped to constant change, and we have to get in front of this. If we don't get in front of this, then we're going to see much higher mortality, we're going to see more biodiversity loss, more loss of various species. The risks in front of us are quite large. The other side of the story, and I liked hearing the comments about business, is that change is underway in addressing these as well. And that helping communicate that there is a lot that's going on. I have gone to far more conferences of the parties than I want to think about, and yet all you read in newspapers is the short summary of what advances, if any, were made on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's no discussion of what advances were made in financial flows, in RED, the deforestation, in adaptation. There's lots that has changed. I was at a meeting quite a few years ago in Australia. It was at a national adaptation meeting, and I was really impressed. They gave out awards for individuals and groups that were doing things. And getting positive stories out, getting people to understand, we're not doing enough, we're not doing it fast enough, we're not sitting still. The story I always tell is I recently went grocery shopping. I'm walking back to my car in the underground parking garage, carrying my groceries, having those internal discussions you have of, should I brought the cart, because why am I carrying all these bags of groceries? And I heard wind chimes. And I could not figure out how I could hear wind chimes in this massive concrete. I stopped, I calculated the distance to the exit, I thought about everything outside the exit. I'm trying to figure out how I could hear wind chimes in a parking garage. It took me, as you can tell, a little bit to figure it out. I could only hear electric vehicles. They all make a noise at low speed, and heaven forbid a Tesla sound like a Ford. So they all make different noises at low speed, and there was, I don't know, half a dozen electric vehicles, and it sounded like wind chimes. And it was, for me, it was a profound experience, because this is the future. Parking garages that are no longer stinky, that are no longer noisy, of going down there and basically hearing wind chimes, and you can hear the tires on the concrete. But then you start thinking further about it. What does it mean for our cities when the major transportation corridors are only electric vehicles? When there's no pollution on those corridors? Do those then become places people want to move back to because they're closer to the buses? There's going to be so much change that will be positive. We need to encourage this as much as we can. We need to catch up on so many issues we're behind on. And so to come back to the question of what's the biggest risk is we're not going to do enough. And the more we can communicate both sides of this issue, the challenges that are faced at the local scale, the challenges that are faced at the global scale, what we can do about the governance, but also how can we celebrate what has been done and make sure that people see that and understand the benefits for the change that's coming. I'm sure you've all seen the cartoon. It's a convention around climate change, and somebody says, well, what if we changed the world for a better place and we didn't need to? And that's where we're at.
I think that's a nice, wonderful sentiment. I think that we lose sight of that there's a lot of people out there in the world, and we have a lot of energy alternatives. It's just a matter of making that transition. So how do we communicate this to people? And I want to ask Dr. Thayer, Thayer, you've done studies on how to get through. What are the things that are most easy for people to grasp and digest?
On? No.
Mine works.
It is? Okay, good. Yeah, sorry. Well, I brought some slides to answer that question, if that's okay. So I guess just to backtrack a little bit, I just want to say that focusing on health and climate is really important because very little journalism does. When there have been content analyses of climate change news, very little of it focuses on health. And when it's out there, there often isn't a link made between climate change and health. So what I mean by that is, it might say something like, and then there'll be more heat waves, but it doesn't say which will cause more of this, which were caused by fossil fuels. There's often very little specific factors, diseases mentioned, and the climate action co-benefits are rarely mentioned. But when you go to your question about what moves people, what moves this slide deck? Oh, okay. Basically, so research that people at my center have done has shown that writing about climate change and health and solutions is actually very good at increasing people's cognitive and affective engagement. particularly for conservatives. It's depolarizing. You were mentioning about, how we don't want to be talking about penguins. We want to be talking about people. We want to be talking locally, and we want to tell them what's working. And so, that's really critical. Of course, we need to warn them about what's not working, but when you also show them what is working, it really changes people's ability to engage with the issue, because when you just tell people it's bad all the time, they kind of shut down. And that's really, we know this from health communication research, not just climate change communication research. Just think about it. If your doctor's like, you're gonna die, then you're like, great, who cares? But if they say, well, if you don't want to die, then here's how you could avoid it, you're like, oh, okay, especially if you start to feel like, hey, I can do those things. And it's the same thing with when we just constantly tell people, we're all going to die of dengue fever. Like, we need to warn people, but we also need to show them how we can combat it and what's working. And so, one thing we've been talking about a lot of different things today. Journalists talk about heat the most, at least in the global north. We talk about heat the most, and yet people are actually really interested in food, water, and vector-borne illnesses, mostly because they don't know that much about them. So they're worried about them, and they're intrigued. And so, not that, again, we shouldn't focus on heat, but the more we can paint the fuller picture is really important. This was a study done by several folks from my center. And again, when you show the policy solutions, the ones that are most effective are in motivating people are clean energy and community design. And the single most effective thing is to show people the risks, the solutions, but also social norms, meaning showing people that they're not alone in wanting action, or they're not alone in being worried about this. And so those are some pretty important things to report on. And again, this is true for Republicans and Democrats. Can I go to the next slide? So I'm just going to sort of quickly go through this. Sorry, I'm not meaning to.
I think your research is really important, because you've shown how to get through, and we all want to know how we should focus our work so that people actually read it and take it to heart, so go through it slow.
Okay. Some research, not done by me, but done by folks at my center, shows there's basically 6 types of Americans when it comes to thinking and opinions about global warming. And there has been some of this work replicated in other countries, such as India. There's one coming out about China. And so some of this work is on our website. But basically, people are in a range from their beliefs, their concern, and their motivation to do something about global warming. And if you look at this, you can see that more than half the people in the US are concerned and alarmed about global warming. And this has gone up over the years, so we have trend data on this. So communicating about it is working. And next slide, please. So basically, the big picture idea is that obviously, the less concerned you are, the less worried about it, the less willing you are to process information, the less certain you are that global warming is happening. And if we can go to the next slide. And can you click one more? Maybe 2 more. So basically, and if you could click one more time. Sorry. Okay. So what you want to think about is who's in your audience. And if your audience is filled with alarmed and concerned folks, like maybe you are in a blue state, let's say, then solutions information is particularly engaging to them. If you have folks more in the middle in your audience, solutions still works because it's depolarizing, but also showing them that climate change is a here, now, and us problem. People care about their communities, they care about their families. They don't have to believe that climate change is real to see what's happening in their communities and to be worried about the effects of heat, of pollution, of diseases. And so, also humans really struggle with processing things that are far off in time, distance, and geography, right? So it's really hard for us, again, like if your doctor's like, you might develop this disease 50 years from now, exactly, you're like, right? So it's really hard for us as humans when we report on climate change. It's really hard for us to process it when we report on it as, oh no, the polar bears. That most of us don't live near any polar bears. I mean, they're cute, right? And some of us really love animals, but some of us don't intrinsically love animals. And so, it's like, what does that mean to me? And so the more you can make climate change a here and now problem, the more you can reach people who aren't necessarily predisposed or who might have partisan leanings that might cause them to reject it. And then trying not to needlessly tick off people who are dismissive. So how do you do that? Next slide. Okay, can you click one more time too? These slides, you'll have them. I'm sorry this is a little hard to see, but basically we break down who the most trusted sources are for each group based on their status of whether they're alarmed, concerned, so on and so forth. So for people who are disengaged, their primary care doctor is the source they trust most about climate change. Not the EPA, not the CDC, not the National Academy of Sciences, right? And so, of course, this isn't to say, oh, don't quote, science experts, but what if you called up local doctors in town? What if you called up doctors you knew who were engaged in fighting against climate-induced diseases or climate health effects, right? And so, again, thinking about who your audience is and what sources they'll trust for that information is one way you can really engage different audiences. And I think I have one more slide. Do I have one more slide? Yeah, again, here, we can look at, again, broken down by these different segments of people's climate opinion beliefs, how much they want to know about solutions, impacts, causes. And if you go to the next slide. This, again, it might be a little hard to see, but and these slides will be sent out, but if you look at that web link, we run studies twice a year with our partners at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. We survey Americans twice a year about all their attitudes and opinions, and we have lots of reports. But the folks at Yale have a team that have downscaled the data to, I believe, the county level. You can go in and look at how people in your county feel about a range of issues related to climate change, which could help you understand your audience, help you focus on what stories to tell. But this one I just pulled up showed the estimated percentage of adults in your county who want to know about stories to address climate change, which I think is pretty important. Yeah. She wants to do something as soon as I'm done. I'll just say one more thing. I can talk a lot more about solutions reporting, and I'll just say this. The evidence for solutions reporting is really nascent when it comes to climate change. But what we do know, and what some of my research has shown, is that it does seem to make people feel better. they feel better when they hear about climate solutions, which is a good thing, because then maybe they'll read and view and listen to your stories more. It does seem to make them, and it's really complicated in the sense that it depends what aspect of climate change you're talking about, feel a little bit more like they can do something about it, and then in turn support climate policy. But that picture's really complicated, like I said. And so I just want to be clear, like, it's not like you write about a solution, everyone reads it, and they're like, woohoo, now I'm going to support more, pro-climate action. Unsurprisingly, people feel differently about wildfires than they do about food waste, than they feel about climate justice, than they feel about waterborne diseases. But overall, the evidence points to the fact that there are benefits to showing people how climate solutions have here and now impacts in their community.
And if I could add to that, and you can certainly talk more about this after I rush out, another critical finding from this research is only 1 in 3 Americans is willing to talk about climate change with anybody else. So there's very high levels of anxiety, but people will not talk with each other. And that can be a goal for your reporting, of thinking of ways to get these discussions started, because that's how we build the political will.
Catherine, I wanted to ask you, one of the things I was very struck, one of the things I was very struck by with Hurricane Helene is that it went up in the mountains. And for those of you who don't know, that's so unusual that it had that much power, that's how much kinetic energy it had absorbed from the warm Gulf waters. So, I know you talked about solutions, but it would seem to me that something like unpacking, something like that, would that convince people? The fact that this is the first time, maybe one of the first times we've ever seen something like this. Asheville has always seen itself as a climate haven, and yet, the city was demolished. Does the research show that, or?
Are you asking if we show people what might happen, would it change their minds?
What has happened?
Yeah, I think that's really complicated in that I think what the research shows generally is that people basically, in general, not just with climate change, they don't believe it will happen to them. They're much more likely to believe it will happen to someone else, particularly if it hasn't happened or it hasn't been likely. In terms, I do think, just anecdotally, people have been shocked by what happened in Asheville, but I don't think we have any research yet that specifically says, now people are changing their minds.
Like in Louisiana, they always get hurricanes, and Katrina was terrible, but they've had some pretty catastrophic. So this is something different. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit, and because we're kind of running out of time, and I really appreciate. Did we finish your slides?
I just realized, if you could just go to the last slide, it's just a QR
I'm sorry.
code.
Go ahead.
No, it's just a QR code. I just realized, because I went through this really quickly, if you want to receive our research in a newsletter, it's not a lot, You're not going to be spammed, but we have lots of studies that are always coming out. So, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Did I mention the handout? Okay, well, I just want to make sure that, Amber was going to put it on the website. We had an excellent handout from the NOAA, and it has it's just chock full of excellent information on where to find resources. So that will be on the website. I want to make sure that I mention that. Well, I did want to switch gears just a teeny bit, and I'm going to open this up first to Nicholas. So we now have an incoming administration who, the first day of his press conference, said that the first thing I'm going to do on day one is put a stop to this climate change hoax. And there was a lot of progress under the Biden administration on this, and we're going to see, I think we're going to see a reverse. So how do we, A, deal with this as journalists, and, B, you and I have talked about this, Nicholas. I mean, you're at the Washington Post. I mean, you're like sort of on the front lines there, So how do we deal with this as journalists?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta keep covering it. I don't know. The storylines change, right? Like, and my beat is climate solutions, and so for the past year, that's meant like, well, what are we gonna do with like this giant funnel of money coming out of the IRA? Or whatever, all the different ways the federal government has been trying to invest in solutions, and then you cover that one way to say, well, what's the impact of that going to be, and also what are the ways those solutions fall short, and that kind of thing. And now it's probably going to be a different category of stories, but I don't know. I mean, all you can do is keep covering it,
Right.
And yeah, I think like my whole team at the Post is kind of reorienting what is our plan going to be when a new administration comes in and changes the federal government's approach and funding and everything towards climate change.
Really? Well, I hope you feel protected. I wanted to ask you, we sort of talked about this a little bit, is, one of the things that people said happened on Tuesday was that there was a lot of disinformation. And how do you break through that? I mean, that's the thing that I see now is the social media, and there's just a lot of disinformation out there. I mean, is there any studies on how we can break through this?
So I'm gonna give a two-part answer. I would say there's a lot of research on climate misinformation and disinformation, and I would suggest looking at research from Sander van der Linden, 3 words, because I am not, like, my area of expertise is not climate disinformation, but there's lots of research on, like, how do you do it? And one thing that they have found really big picture is it's better to pre-bunk than debunk, meaning it's better to get out ahead of it than have to go back and fix it later. And this happens in all types of misinformation because once we get an idea in our mind as humans, no matter how much you know, it's really hard to undo that thought. Even when you literally know it's incorrect, it's really hard to undo it. So, I mean, but then when you think about misinformation generally, I have done some research on health misinformation, and there's basically 2 things to think about. It's increasing the supply of good and accurate information and decreasing the supply of bad information. And I think where journalists can come in is increasing the supply of accurate information, and where they cannot do as much is decreasing it. And some of that is going to have to be done by government regulation, by tech companies. Obviously, who knows what will happen with that now. But I think the lane that journalists can play in is increasing the supply of accurate information, as well as recognizing the factors that lead people to believe in disinformation or misinformation. And they have been shown to be correlated with, and I mean, this is what the research shows, conservative political leaning, lack of education, and some other social demographic factors. And those aren't the only things. It's not just all social demographic. There's some psychological factors that make people more likely to absorb and accept misinformation, and you can't really do anything about that because you can't run a psychological profile of every one of your readers or viewers in advance, but you can think about, okay, who's my audience, right? And if your audience is more susceptible to misinformation, you should think about what can you do to counter that, and again, it goes back to trusted sources, and to remember that the people that you think are trusted sources are not necessarily trusted sources for those groups. So who can you be bringing into your stories that when they read it, they don't think, oh, well, you know, I'm anti-government, so I'm not going to listen to what this government source said in the story. So that's something journalists can do.
Thank you. I wanted to switch gears just a teeny bit, and I'm kind of, I know, catching you off guard. Nisa, what do you think under the administration is going to happen with worker protections? Because, you know, I think back during COVID, and Trump ordered the meatpacking plants to be open, and I'm sure you know all about this. This was a really horrific story. He ordered the meatpacking plants to be open, and you know there was no protection, you know, no social distancing, no masks. So a lot of the meatpacking people got sick, died, and at one point, 8% of all the COVID infections started in meatpacking plants, because you know then they would go back to their communities. So do you see a real rollback of worker protections probably coming down the line based on previous? And you know what can be done about that? Yeah, I know, a big question, I know.
Yeah, I do see that there will be some rollback of protections, but I think that the organizations that are actively working on worker protections and advocacy are already aware. They know what's coming because we've kind of been down this road before. And so I think there's going to be a lot of mobilization. I think some of that mobilization is already happening. And I think a lot of organizations are just kind of like getting ready to implement some emergency contingency plans. Definitely it'll happen. I don't know how soon it'll happen.
How it's gonna
I think
play
we can count on
itself
the
out.
I think we can count on the Trump administration to be a little more efficient this time around.
Yeah, unfortunately. We're having some technical difficulties up here.
What I would say that can be done is for us journalists to cover some of these issues, how rollbacks of those protections are going to be affecting workers, and you can cite your own reporting from between around 2020 when we had the beginning of the pandemic. One thing I wanted to get back to was Catherine was mentioning some of the things that people care about, and she said heat, food, not so much heat, but food and water. And I think that one way that we can actually cover that is how it's going to actually affect our access to food, how food is going to be produced, and whether we're going to have access to that food.
So before we open it up to questions, is there anything anybody wants to add on this? No, Nicholas? No? Okay. All right, well, I think we can open it up to questions. Thank you guys, by the way. It's a very, very interesting discussion.
Who wants
We
the
have a lot to
microphone?
do.
Chris.
Going back a bit in terms of climate reporting, so much of it was negative about all of the horrendous things that were going to be happening. To some degree, it was in the future, and so people were able to kind of say, it's not going to be happening to me. But that kind of scare reporting got criticized, and a lot of organizations, including the Washington Post, started climate solutions as a way to actually engage people and make them feel like they're not totally powerless or helpless, that there are things that can be done. What is your sense of, now that this has been going on for a couple of years, how effective has this climate solutions approach been? Have you gotten better feedback? Is it really engaging more people in that the fear stuff was basically turning people away?
He's asking.
I would also love to hear your thoughts, but
Go first.
yeah, I think that I mean, I'm speaking anecdotally as somebody like writing some of these stories. I think we do get a lot of traffic on some of them, and people are interested and seem to be looking for ways that either they can do something directly to help, or they just want to understand what is being done. And I think like, I don't know, I think the story of climate change has like just shifted over time, and it seems to me like the most relevant thing right now is to try to just kind of call balls and strikes on like which solutions work, which make sense, and which aren't working. It's probably the most relevant thing that we can talk about. And I also think like it avoids some of the paralysis trap that you're talking about, that like nobody wants to engage with gloomy stuff that they've already heard before. It's like, you know, if it's a bummer and boring, it's like a really deadly combination. And so if you write about solutions, like, you know, a lot of these are kind of novel, or people are like heard less about them. And either they work or they don't, but one way or the other, that's kind of interesting. And then, yeah, like, you know, we also get a lot of traction if we do stories about, like, here are things you can do in your everyday life, which aren't going to be, you know, as individually impactful as, like, is your utility company going to build a wind turbine or not? But people also seem to be interested in that. So I'll just say, like, my ant's eye view, I think that we do get interest from people on that kind of coverage. Yeah, I mean, you know, ask my editor, but I think people do read the stuff, and I get emails from people, you know, asking questions about these kind of stories, and like that makes me feel like, I don't know, somebody's reading and people are like engaging with it.
And I can just say that, yes, it's on, right? I can say that we don't have, you know, specific studies of specific news outlets, but all the major surveys of what audiences want, like the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, people always say they want more climate solutions, and particularly younger folks want more climate solutions. And so at least, you know, we may not know for any one specific outlet, but we do know that audiences really say they want it. I think the key is where are those audiences getting their news from, right? And that's a whole other thing, is that younger people want more climate solutions, but they're less likely to be reading legacy media outlets. And so that's something I would urge people to consider, like, how can you, and the Post does a great job of this too, right, of like having great TikTok accounts and things like that. You know, how can you move your stories to digital and social to attract those audiences that might not read it? I will say TV, people still get a lot of their climate news from TV, especially older people.
Hey, I think it's me. Well, thank you so much. I had a question for you, Catherine, actually. I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about how people think this is never going to happen to them. And I remember that now with what happened in Spain, I read an editorial that was like trying to make the case that in talking about climate change, we've been focused so much on like disadvantaged communities and like talking about how this is going to affect like poor people, that it's easier for richer people to say, oh, I'm going to be fine. So yeah, I would love to hear, what do you think about that? Do you think it's like a double-edged sword in that sense?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say the research on how climate communication about disadvantaged groups affects a larger population is kind of lacking, but what we do know from other health communication research is that there can be backfire effects by focusing on how, like, health disparities, things like that. On one hand, it can raise awareness, and I do have a study that I just conducted that isn't published yet, but where we showed that news about the inequitable distribution of heat islands due to racist housing policies and things like that, how that actually did raise people's awareness of climate injustice and perceptions of climate injustice and their support for climate policy. But on the flip side, what can happen is that when you write about groups that are marginalized or things like that and talk about the health disparities they face, it can increase marginalization. It can decrease support for those policies, and it can further that belief that, oh, not going to happen to me if I'm not of that group. Again, we don't have that really for climate so much, but we do know that from health other health issue research. So, I mean, the tricky thing, right, is that doesn't mean we should stop reporting on it, right? I mean, that would be irresponsible as journalists to just say, well, you know, because there are these backfire effects, we're not going to tell the whole story, we're not going to speak truth to power. You still have to do that, but I think the more that you can arm yourself with knowing what some of the possible backfire effects might be, and the more research that people like me can do and that we're trying to do, and hopefully get funding to do, into what are those effects would be really helpful.
In terms of covering the climate solutions, is there any research or anything like that on whether people respond more to like individualized solutions versus broader? Like if you like eat less meat or you don't use plastic straws or whatever versus wind and solar is better. Like those are both climate solutions. Is one type more resonant than the other?
So the answer is complicated. So there isn't a lot of journalism research that looks at that. The existing research more focuses on societal level solutions. There is research that focuses on not journalism, but other types of communication. I guess that was controversial. So there is some research showing like what happens if you strategically communicate about different types of policies. And the picture is mixed. It depends on the policy. People don't like to tend to be encouraged to eat less meat. You know, they also, it also depends on what country they're in. There's so many factors. So complicated answer. I'd be happy to share some of that research, but you know, unfortunately, we can't say like it's much better to write about individual solutions versus societal level solutions. We don't have that information.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Oh,
We got one over here.
we have time for one more question.
There is,
Oh, was he first? Okay, you guys figured it out. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
there's quite a bit of research on uptake, and it doesn't come from the journalism, but it comes from uptake. And so, for example, the biggest predictor of solar panels, of uptake of solar panels, is knowing someone who has them. And so you can look at that kind of research, which will give you insights into thinking about how to write about it. Write about people who've put in solar panels and what they've experienced and all those kinds of things. Then can help increase the uptake because people see that others have done it as well. And it's true across the board. So you can look into a completely different area to get insights into perhaps effective ways for covering stories.
Hi, I'm Jeff from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And one of the things we talk about a lot is that very much for clean tech and climate tech is becoming the space where the money is. It's one of the fastest growing industries on the planet, yet it always surprises me when you hear, when you see climate related stories, people don't talk about these burgeoning technologies that really can make a lot of difference and that are out there and ready to be bought and used, but people aren't because they don't know about them. So is this a better pathway to try and especially convince maybe, hopefully, the new administration that this is a good pathway to do? I just want your comments on that.
NREL does amazing stuff, and people should be much more aware of all the great work that you do there. But yes, Texas has got the biggest uptake of renewables because it makes economic sense. And so focusing on that economic piece, on people are not aware of the growth in jobs in the sector, how important this is for the economy. There's lots of ways to come into these stories and show people that there's lots of benefits to your well-being, to your economic growth personally, to the country's economic growth by focusing on the renewables.
All right, a couple announcements, but first let's thank our speakers. And with that, I will hand it off to CASW Director Megan Parker.
Thank you so much to Amber and to Roz for organizing today's workshop, which was truly amazing. And thank you so much to the speakers. And thank you again to the Burroughs Wellcome Fund for the support for today. And speaking of funding, I wanted to pick up on something that Catherine had said about the need to increase coverage of climate change. And I know, given the state of the industry today, many of us in this room are not the ones making that decision about how much coverage is actually done, given the lack of funding, the poor pay, the instability in the industry. CASW is launching a climate news task force, part of the goal of which is to work to put together guidance for foundations and other funders and how they can best support more and better coverage of climate news. So if you'd like to learn more about this or have any questions, please feel free to come and talk to me. And if you know any foundations or donors who would like to support more and better climate coverage, please let us know as well. And thank you all for coming.